The dust from the market square settled on Tazi's bare feet as she pressed herself against the adobe wall of the church. Vendors called out their wares: dried chilies, woven baskets, clay pots that caught the harsh light, but their voices felt distant, muffled by the weight of eyes that followed her wherever she went. She had learned to move like shadow between the stone buildings, to slip through the narrow alleys where the smell of copal incense mixed with the earthiness of wet clay. The other girls her age gathered water at the well, their laughter echoing off the walls, but Taji kept to the edges, always the edges. Her fingers traced the rough texture of the wall as she watched them. Maria, with her bright rebozo and easy smile. Carmen, whose mother sold the finest tortillas in the plaza. They moved through the world with a lightness Taji had never known, their voices mingling with the sounds of daily life, the clatter of wooden wheels on cobblestones, the distant bleating of goats, the soft pat-pat of women making masa. But when evening came and the shadows grew long, when the last vendor packed away his goods and the plaza emptied except for stray dogs and the occasional drunk stumbling home, Taji would climb the hill beyond the village. There, where the wind moved through the mesquite and ocotillo, she would sit among the rocks and open her throat to the sky. Her voice rose like smoke, carrying melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. The wind caught her songs and carried them across the desert, past the saguaro cacti, standing like sentinels in the moonlight, past the dry arroyos where coyotes called to each other in languages older than words. She sang of loneliness that had no name, of a hunger that food could never fill. She sang of the space between what was and what might be, her voice weaving through the darkness like water finding its way through stone. The village below remained unaware. They slept in their adobe houses, behind wooden doors that kept out the night and the wind and the sound of a girl who spoke only to the emptiness above. Don Esteban arrived on a cart, pulled by two tired mules, his milky eyes fixed on something beyond the visible world. The driver, a young man with calloused hands and nervous glances, helped him down carefully, speaking in low tones about the roughness of the road and the distance yet to travel. "This is the place," the old man said, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. He stood in the plaza, his walking stick tapping against the stones, head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. The villagers gathered at a respectful distance. Father Miguel emerged from the church, his brown robes dusty from the morning's walk to visit the sick. He approached the stranger with the careful courtesy reserved for those whose purpose remained unclear. "Welcome, Señor. I am Father Miguel. How may we serve you?" Don Esteban's fingers wrapped around his walking stick, gnarled wood worn smooth by decades of use. "I am a teacher of music, Father. I travel from village to village, searching for voices that carry particular gifts." "We have no musicians here," the priest said gently. "We are simple people. Our children learn to work the land, to tend animals, to make what they need with their hands." "The most beautiful voices," Don Esteban said, "often belong to those who believe they have nothing to offer the world." He found lodging in the house of Señora Morales, a widow whose husband had been trampled by a bull 3 harvests past. She lived alone now, her children grown and scattered to other villages, other lives. The old man's presence filled the empty spaces in her small home, his quiet movements and the soft sound of his breathing at night, a comfort she had not expected. During the day, he sat in the plaza, his fingers moving across the strings of a small guitar, playing melodies that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Children gathered around him, their eyes wide with wonder, but he played for them with a distracted air, as if waiting for something else, something more. Taji watched from the shadows of the church, her heart pulling toward the music like iron drawn to a magnet. She had never heard anything like it, notes that seemed to reach into her chest and stir something that had been sleeping there. But she did not approach. She had learned that wanting something and having the courage to reach for it were different things entirely. 3 days passed before Don Esteban heard her on He had been sitting in Senora Morales's small courtyard, tuning his guitar in the early evening, when the wind shifted and carried something new. A voice that rose and fell like water over stones, pure and wild and achingly beautiful. His fingers stilled on the strings. The voice came from somewhere up the hill, floating down through the mesquite and the silence. It sang without words, or perhaps in a language too old for words, a melody that seemed to contain all the longing and sorrow and hope that had ever existed in the world. He set down his guitar and stood, his milky eyes turning toward the sound. "Senora Morales," he called softly. She emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Si, Don Esteban?" That voice. Who is it? Senora Morales listened, her head tilted. For a moment, there was only the sound of wind in the desert plants, the distant lowing of cattle. Then it came again, high and clear and solitary. "Ah," she said, her voice carrying a note of sadness. "That is Taji. She is different. She speaks to no one, sings only to the wind. Her grandmother raised her, but the old woman died 2 years past. Now she lives alone in the house at the edge of the village." "Alone?" Don Esteban's voice sharpened. "How old is she?" 16, perhaps 17. "It is hard to say. She has always been small, always apart from the others." The old man's fingers gripped his walking stick more tightly. "I must speak with her. She will not come to you, Don Esteban. She fears people, fears being seen. Some say she is touched by spirits, that her voice carries magic. Others say she is simply broken, that her grandmother's death left her lost between worlds." "Then I must go to her." Senora Morales touched his arm gently. "The path up the hill is rough, full of stones and thorns, and she runs when people approach, like a wild animal." But Don Esteban was already moving toward the door, his walking stick tapping against the packed earth floor. "The voice I have been searching for," he said, more to himself than to her. "For 40 years I have traveled these mountains, these deserts, listening, and now—" He paused at the threshold, his blind eyes bright with something that might have been tears. "Now I have found her." The next evening, Don Esteban climbed the hill. His progress was slow, each step careful and deliberate. The walking stick found purchase among the rocks, tested the ground before his feet followed. Thorns caught at his clothes, and twice he stumbled, but he pressed on, following the pull of that voice that had haunted his dreams. Taji saw him coming long before he reached her place among the rocks. She crouched behind a large boulder, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The old man moved with the patience of stone, never hurrying, never faltering despite his blindness. She could run. She knew every path down the back of the hill, every hidden way through the mesquite and prickly pear. But something held her still, something in the way he moved, the way he paused every few steps to listen, as if the wind itself were guiding him. When he finally reached the flat space where she sat each evening, he stopped. For a long moment he simply stood there, his head tilted, listening to the silence that stretched between them. "I know you are there," he said finally, his voice gentle as morning rain. "I can feel your presence, hear your breathing. There is no need to hide." Taji pressed herself deeper into the shadow of the rock, her hand covering her mouth as if to hold back the words that wanted to escape. "I am not here to harm you," Don Esteban continued. "I am here because of your voice, because of what I heard in your song." He lowered himself carefully onto a flat stone, his walking stick laid across his knees. "May I tell you a story?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke. Taji found herself leaning forward, drawn by the quiet certainty in his voice. "Many years ago," Don Esteban began, "when I was young and could still see the world with these eyes, I lived in a great city. I taught music to the children of wealthy families, played in churches and grand houses. I thought I understood what music was, what it could do." He paused, his fingers tracing the smooth wood of his walking stick. "Then I went blind. A fever took my sight, and with it I thought my purpose. What use is a musician who cannot see his students, cannot read the notes on the page? A coyote called from somewhere in the distance, its voice lonely and wild. Don Esteban smiled at the sound. But losing my sight taught me to listen in ways I had never imagined. I learned that the most beautiful music comes not from technique or training, but from the place where the soul touches the world. I began to travel, to search for voices that carried this gift. He turned his face toward the boulder where Taji hid, and tonight I found what I have been seeking. She did not speak to him that night, but she did not run. Don Esteban sat on his stone for an hour, sometimes talking, sometimes simply listening to the wind. When he finally rose to leave, he placed something on the ground, a small clay whistle, shaped like a bird. "For tomorrow," he said, "if you choose to come." Taji waited until his footsteps had faded completely before she crept from her hiding place. The whistle was smooth and warm, as if it had been held in loving hands for years. When she blew into it, it produced a clear, sweet note that seemed to hang in the air like a blessing. The next evening, she was waiting for him. She sat on the far edge of the clearing, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger, but her eyes were fixed on the path where he would appear. When he finally crested the hill, she made a small sound, barely more than a breath, and he turned toward her with the accuracy of a hawk spotting movement in the grass. "You came," he said, settling onto his stone. "I hoped you would." For a long time they sat in silence. The desert around them settled into its evening rhythm, the rustle of small animals in the brush, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through the thorned branches of the ocotillo. "May I hear your song again?" Don Esteban asked finally. Taji's throat tightened. She had sung for the wind, for the empty sky, for the stars that watched from their distant places. But to sing for another person, to offer her voice to ears that would judge and measure and find it wanting. "I know you are afraid," the old man said gently. "I was afraid too, when I first began to understand what my blindness had given me. But fear is not the opposite of courage. It is the place where courage begins." Something in his voice, something patient and understanding, loosened the knot in her chest. She opened her mouth and let the sound pour out, wordless, formless, pure as water from a mountain spring. Don Esteban listened with his whole body, his head tilted, his breathing slow and deep. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Do you know what I hear in your voice?" he asked finally. Taji shook her head, then realized he could not see the gesture. "No," she whispered, the first word she had spoken to another person in months. "I hear the voice of the wind itself," he said. "I hear the song that the desert sings when no one is listening. I hear the sound of loneliness transformed into something beautiful." Each evening, Taji climbed the hill to meet Don Esteban. He brought his guitar, showed her how to breathe from deep in her belly, how to let the sound rise from the earth, through her body, and into the sky. "Music is not about the notes," he told her, as she struggled with a simple melody. "It is about the spaces between the notes, the silence that gives meaning to the sound." He taught her songs in Spanish, in the old tongue his grandmother had spoken, in languages that had no names but carried the weight of centuries. Her voice wrapped around each melody like morning mist around mountain peaks, finding harmonies that existed only in the moment of their creation. "You sing like someone who has learned to speak with ghosts," he said one evening, after she had finished a lament that left them both sitting in stunned silence. "My grandmother said the dead speak through music," Taji replied, her voice still barely above a whisper. "She said some people are born with ears that can hear them." Don Esteban nodded slowly. "And what do they tell you? That loneliness is not emptiness. That silence is not the absence of sound." She paused, searching for words to contain what she felt. "That some songs can only be sung by those who have lost everything." Below them, the village settled into sleep. Yellow light flickered in windows, then died away one by one, leaving only the stars and the endless conversation of the wind with the desert. Word of the evening lessons spread through the village like water through cracked earth. Some spoke of it with wonder, The blind teacher and the girl who sang to the wind, meeting each night on the hill like figures from an old story. Others whispered of impropriety, of a young woman spending her evenings alone with a stranger. Father Miguel visited Senora Morales, his concern evident in the way he twisted his hat in his hands. The girl has no family, no one to guide her. People are beginning to talk. What do they say? The widow asked, though she already knew. That it is not proper for her to spend so much time with Don Esteban, that she should be learning to cook, to sew, to prepare for marriage, that music is a luxury poor people cannot afford. Senora Morales set down her mending and looked at the priest with eyes that had seen too much of the world's harshness. And what do you say, Father? I say that God gives gifts to whom he chooses, and we should not question his wisdom. But I also say that the girl must live in this world, with these people, long after Don Esteban continues his journey. Meanwhile, on the hill, Don Esteban sensed the change in the air. Taji's voice carried new tension, her songs filled with an urgency that spoke of time running short. "They want me to stop coming," she said one evening, her words cutting through the desert silence like a blade. "Who wants you to stop?" "Everyone. They say it is not proper, that I should be learning women's work, that music will not feed me when I am old." Don Esteban's fingers found the strings of his guitar, playing a soft melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "And what do you say?" "I say that I have been hungry all my life, and food has never filled the emptiness. But when I sing—" She paused, her voice catching. "When I sing, I feel whole for the first time." "Then you must choose," the old man said gently. "You must decide what kind of life you want to live, one that satisfies others, or one that satisfies your soul." The confrontation came on a Tuesday, when the market was at its busiest, and the whole village seemed to pulse with the energy of commerce and gossip. Taji had ventured into the plaza to buy corn flour, her movements quick and nervous, her eyes fixed on the ground. She was counting coins into the vendor's palm when Carmen appeared beside her, her voice loud enough to carry across the square. "So it is true," Carmen said, her smile sharp as broken glass. "You do speak, but only to strangers, never to us." Taji's hand tightened on the remaining coins. She could feel the weight of watching eyes, the sudden stillness that meant everyone was listening. "We have been friends since childhood," Carmen continued, her voice rising. "We played together, shared our dreams, our secrets. But when my mother offers to teach you to weave, when Maria invites you to gather water with us, you turn away like we are diseased." Taji began, but the words stuck in her throat. "But for the old man, the stranger, you sing like an angel, every night up on the hill, like some kind of witch calling to the spirits." Carmen's voice dripped with wounded pride and jealousy. "What makes him worthy of your voice when we are not?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Taji looked around the plaza, at the faces of people she had known all her life, and saw in their eyes a mixture of hurt and anger and incomprehension. "He listens," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "He listens to what I have to say." "We would listen too," Maria said, stepping forward. "We have always been ready to listen, but you never gave us the chance." Taji felt the truth of this, like a physical blow. She had wrapped herself in silence and solitude, had convinced herself that she was unwanted when perhaps she had simply been unwilling to be known. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Of what?" Carmen demanded. "Of us? Of people who have known you since you were born. Of being ordinary," Taji said, the words coming out in a rush. "Of having nothing special to offer, nothing that would make you want to keep me." The admission fell into the silence like a stone into still water. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then Carmen's expression softened, and she reached out to touch Taji's arm. "Hermana," she said gently, "do you not know? You were never ordinary, not even before you learned to sing." That evening Don Esteban waited on the hill, but Taji did not come. He sat on his stone as the sun set, and the stars appeared one by one, his guitar silent across his knees. The wind carried the usual sounds, coyotes calling, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of desert plants moving in the breeze. But no voice rose to meet the darkness. No song transformed the silence into something beautiful. He waited until the moon reached its zenith, then rose and made his way slowly down the hill. The next morning, he found her sitting on the steps of the church, her head bowed, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up as he approached, and he could hear the weight of decision in her breathing. "I have been thinking," she said without preamble, "about what you said, about choosing the kind of life I want to live." Don Esteban settled beside her, his walking stick propped against the stone wall. "And what have you decided?" "That I want to choose both. I want to sing, to learn everything you can teach me, but I also want to live in this world with these people." She paused, her voice gaining strength. "I want to sing for them." "That is a brave choice," Don Esteban said. "But are you certain? Once you share your gift with others, it no longer belongs only to you." "It never belonged only to me," Taji replied. "The wind taught me that. Songs are meant to be shared, to travel from heart to heart, like seeds on the breeze." That evening, instead of climbing the hill, she stood in the plaza as the sun set and the villagers gathered for their evening conversations. Her voice rose clear and strong, carrying a melody that seemed to weave itself into the very fabric of the twilight. One by one, the conversations stopped. People turned toward the sound, their faces soft with wonder. Children crept closer, their eyes wide. Even the dogs seemed to listen, their heads tilted, their usual restlessness stilled. She sang of the desert's beauty, of the way morning light turned the mountains purple and gold. She sang of the strength that came from enduring hardship, of the way love could grow in the most unlikely places. She sang of loneliness transformed into solitude, of silence that spoke louder than words. When she finished, the plaza was completely quiet. Then, slowly, the applause began. Not the wild clapping of excitement, but the gentle, sustained applause of people who had been deeply moved. Don Esteban stood at the edge of the crowd, his face bright with tears. He had found what he had been searching for, and now he was watching it bloom into something even more beautiful than he had imagined. The old man stayed for another month, teaching Taji everything he could about breathing, about rhythm, about the way music could heal wounds that medicine could not touch. He taught her songs from every place he had traveled, melodies that carried the stories of different peoples, different ways of seeing the world. "Remember," he said during their final lesson, "that your voice is not just yours. It belongs to everyone who hears it, everyone who is changed by it. Use it wisely." On the morning of his departure, the entire village gathered to see him off. His mules were loaded with gifts, food for the journey, a blanket woven by Carmen's mother, a small wooden cross carved by the village carpenter. Taji stood apart from the crowd, her heart too full for words. Don Esteban approached her slowly, his walking stick tapping against the stones. "This is not goodbye," he said, pressing something into her hands. "This is the beginning of everything you will become." She looked down and saw his guitar, its wood worn smooth by years of use, its strings bright with promise. "I cannot take this," she whispered. "You must," he replied. "It belongs to you now. Use it to teach others, to plant seeds of music wherever you go." As the cart pulled away, Taji lifted the guitar and began to play. The melody was simple, bittersweet, a song of gratitude and loss and hope, all woven together. Her voice rose above the sound of wheels on stone, above the snuffling of the mules, above the murmur of the crowd. Don Esteban smiled as the music followed him down the dusty road. He had spent 40 years searching for the voice that would carry his legacy forward, and now he had found her, not just in the girl who sang to the wind, but in the young woman who had learned to sing to the world. Behind him, Taji's voice continued to rise, carrying on the desert air like a prayer, like a promise, like the wind itself singing the songs that had been waiting all along to be heard. The village had found its voice, and the voice had found its home. In the years that followed, Taji would teach music to the children of the village, her voice weaving itself into the fabric of their daily lives. She would sing at weddings and funerals, at celebrations and times of sorrow, her guitar always in her hands, Don Esteban's lessons always in her heart. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the desert was quiet, travelers passing through would hear her voice rising from the plaza and stop to listen, their own hearts stirring with recognition of something beautiful and true and eternal. The girl who had once sung only to the wind had learned to sing to the world, and the world had learned to sing back. But not every day was peaceful. As time passed, Taji's voice reached not only open hearts, but also ears hardened by fear of change. Whispers began to stir among the elders, murmurs that the songs were shifting the customs of the village, that the music was drawing the young away from the silent traditions of the desert. They said that melodies, while beautiful, could also be dangerous, that they could stir questions that had long lain buried beneath the surface of quiet obedience. Taji listened without anger. She honored those who had walked before her, but she could not deny the truth that rang out in every chord she played. Music, she believed, was not a force that changed people. It was a mirror that revealed what already lived within them. The unease it sparked came not from the sound, but from the truths that the sound uncovered. One night, beneath a sky thick with stars, she made a quiet decision. She would no longer wait for approval to share what she had been given. She invited the entire village to the square, not for a festival or a celebration, but for something simpler. Just her voice, her guitar, and the vast night above. When the villagers arrived, drawn by curiosity more than conviction, they found no stage, no banners, no fanfare. Only Taji, seated on the stone steps beneath the old lantern, her guitar resting gently on her lap. Then, without introduction or explanation, she began to sing a song they had never heard before, a song not taught by Don Esteban, but one born within her, note by note, shaped by every moment of silence and sorrow and joy she had lived. The melody was gentle, but unshakable. It was a song about roots and wings, about holding close what was sacred while embracing what was new. It spoke of a village that had known hardship and of a girl who had once sung only to the wind. It carried no judgment, only invitation. Something shifted in the crowd. First, it was just a few glances softened. Then hands once folded in skepticism began to rest open in laps. Feet, hesitant, tapped quietly in rhythm. The children laughed. The younger ones whispered, even the oldest among them, those who had muttered about danger and disruption, seemed to exhale something they hadn't realized they were holding. That night, the village square changed. It became more than a place of passing and commerce. It became a sanctuary for stories, a cradle for voices. Taji had become something greater than a musician. She had become a keeper of memory, a planter of seeds, and every time she saw someone smile through a song or weep softly during a melody of mourning, she felt Don Esteban with her, not as a memory, but as a presence. In the strum of every string, in the breath between verses, he was there. Taji's journey was still unfolding, but it was already clear. Through her voice and her hands, she had done more than learn music. She had begun to transform a people, and perhaps in time, the world.